Blueberry River First Nation are a Treaty 8 First Nation, so that means that they, along with many of the other First Nations, are signatories to Treaty 8 with the Crown, and that's where the Crown made the solemn promises that in exchange for the surrender of the land that Blueberry River First Nation and the other First Nations held and had used for thousands of years before the arrival of settler society, in exchange for the surrender of that land to allow for peaceful settlement up in that area, there would be the promise that they would be able to carry on their hunting, fishing, trapping as they'd always done, and very importantly that they would remain undisturbed in their way of life, in their economic patterns. And so the way of life that they knew when their ancestors signed the treaty would be assured to them in perpetuity. That was the basis for entering into the treaty. But there was a clause in the treaty that said that, of course, all of this is subject to the Crown's right to take up land from time to time for various purposes related to settlement and development of industry. But then the Crown's right to take up the land here and there from time to time accelerated and became from time to time to time to time, and the gas fields grew and the forestry grew and hydroelectric was developed in their territory. The existing major hydroelectric dams are in the Blueberries territory, but then of course the gas fields were a major source of clearing. And members were finding they'd have to go out for days and days and not come back with anything. And then they were finding that when they could find a moose, for instance, they were often unhealthy when they were dissected. They were seeing that a lot. They were seeing the water quality and quantity change. They're just noticing change upon change upon change, and this increasing displacement, so much so that the whole beaten watershed to the north of their reserve, which had always been a really important hunting ground to them, is referred to now by the community as having gone dark. It's just not an area they even go anymore. It's just a checkerboard of oil and gas exploration or forestry clear cuts. We were heading up a big logging road just to look at some areas that had been really productive, important hunting and berry gathering grounds. And as we were driving, things were happening so quickly. The Blueberry River First Nation received so many referrals from the Oil and Gas Commission a month that they in some cases they can't even keep track of them because there are so many applications coming in to put new gas wells in and new lines in. At one point we were driving up and I was with one of the members, and her hands came up to her face and she said, "Oh my God, we were just picking blueberries with my son there in August." And this was now early October, and the whole area had been shorn and a gas well had been put in. And they hadn't even known. I mean, this just caught them by surprise. We happened to be driving by, and this had been one of the grounds that they'd returned to for years. And we were on this road, and we came across what was obviously an old campsite where they used to hang the moose meat to dry. So you've got two trees, and then you've got a third strapped up between them, and that's where you'd hang the moose after you'd cut it, and that would be part of the camp activity. So an evidently used cultural site. You could see the animal tracks going back and forth to it. You could see the remains of a campsite there. So this would be obviously a significant cultural heritage site, one that would have had some use in at least mid-century and probably since then, but an old one, an important one. So it was preserved. But surrounding us, we had just walked off the logging road, and it was probably maybe twice the distance between where you and I are now. So say 10 meters from the logging road to this site. And then beside us, it made a triangle. Beside us was a pipeline right-of-way that had been cleared that was equal distance, and on the other side of the triangle was a seismic line. So it was this perfectly preserved archaeological site that was useless to no one, useful to no one, because you could even see the animal tracks going through it. I mean, it had been a game trail, but now it was this preserved emblem in the middle of this triangle of total destruction. And that was, that really struck me as an example of how the cumulative impacts of all of these developments, because each one of those disturbances would have been unrelated to the others. Right, that when they had been approved by the Crown, not one of them would have been approved contingent upon the presence of the other disturbances. And so that's how this sort of thing has happened. Now that's an extreme case, but that's what's happening up in their territory, is that each approval is being given in isolation. And despite Blueberry River First Nation raising it with the Crown that it's a very significant problem that the cumulative impacts, the additive impacts, and then the synergistic impacts of that, which is what happens when you finally add it all together and it has the effect greater than the whole of the additions, like a gestalt, I guess. That the Crown's not taking that into account when it's doing its resource permitting. It's not doing a land use planning that takes into account those cumulative impacts, and is certainly not doing so taking into account what that impact has on the First Nations' ability to carry on their treaty rights, carry out their way of life. So it's not at all the first time First Nations have gone head to head with the government. There's been a tremendous amount of litigation between First Nations and the Crown in British Columbia and in Canada. But this is the first time that a claim like this will be heard by the courts. There was a claim filed in Alberta that's on a similar basis by a Treaty 8 First Nation. And that case was launched several years before this, but it hasn't come to trial yet. But this is the first claim based upon treaty breach arising from the cumulative impacts of resource development that we're familiar with in Canada. That's 85% of their territory. So they're really, the facts of this case really are what have pushed Blueberry to sort of have to be at the forefront in terms of bringing this kind of claim forward. This is a civil suit brought against the government of British Columbia in the BC Supreme Court that was filed in March of 2015. We are not seeking to overturn any decision that's already happened. We're seeking a remedy for the future. We're asking the court to declare that the Crown is in breach of its treaty obligations to the First Nation, and we're asking that based upon that declaration, the court order that further land development not occur until it's been established that it won't infringe those rights further. And so it seeks to put some substantive constraints on the land development that'll happen there. It won't, it doesn't intend to be and wouldn't be a full-scale stop on industry in the area. Blueberry River First Nation has always been clear that it's not against industry. It is against losing its cultural continuity to sort of an unchecked industrial advance. So the relief that we're seeking would put some constraint on that. One of the Blueberry River First Nation worked with David Suzuki Foundation to do an analysis of just sort of how to quantify the encroachments in their territory, and that analysis, which is based entirely on government of British Columbia data, it revealed that 85% of Blueberry's territory is within 500 meters of some industrial disturbance.